Thank you all for coming today. In the classic play, Life of Galileo by Bertolt Brecht, Galileo states, "Unhappy is the land that needs a hero." Unfortunately, Egypt is an unhappy land today, in need of not one hero, but many heroes. At the epicenter of Egypt's problems is the radicalization of its society. The Islamization of the public space and political life further marginalizes Copts from those spheres. I'm pleased to introduce this very distinguished panel today who will be speaking about Egypt's cost for radicalization of society and the marginalization of Copts. So since there's no preference in terms of speaking, I'll just go from left to right. My left is Ambassador Alberto Fernandez. He's the president of the Middle East Broadcasting Network, MBN, which oversees 2 television channels and all of MBN's digital and social media properties. Prior to joining MBN, Ambassador Fernandez was vice president of the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI. He also served as U.S. ambassador to Equatorial Guinea and U.S. Chargé d'Affaires to Sudan. Ambassador Fernandez was a recipient of the 2008 Presidential Meritorious Service Award, the 2006 Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in Public Diplomacy, and the 2003 Superior Honor Award for his work in Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Fernandez.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here at Coptic Solidarity. I think this is my 3rd time, and I want to thank the leadership, especially my good friend Magdi, for inviting me to speak. You know, the phrasing of this panel is interesting, and I'm going to be very intrigued how my colleagues in the panel treat it, because it's very vague, and it can be interpreted in many different ways. And I thought, what can I add to a discussion that would be perhaps not the usual thing that we've heard, and not prejudicing what my colleagues are going to say. I tried to think of a different tack. You know, when we think of the cost of radicalization, the cost of marginalization of Egypt's Copts, I thought, well, cost, let's be a little literal and think of cost in an economic sense. We can talk about a moral dimension. We can talk about a humanistic dimension. Certainly those are very legitimate things. But I wanted to look at the issue of radicalization in Egypt and the marginalization of Egypt's largest minority group in a kind of economic and socioeconomic sense. And I try to be as brief as I can. I think the obvious point one could make is that the same type of person that is going to be bigoted and abusive towards Coptic Christians are likely to be the same way towards foreigners, towards tourists, towards investors, towards government efforts at real reform. And I think that overlap is often forgotten. You can look at Egypt's economic situation, and I know there's tremendous poverty in Egypt, and that can't be glossed over or minimized. But, you know, we can say that the Egyptian government is trying, certainly in the economic sphere, making real efforts at economic reform in the last 3 years at the macro level. So you see progress in things like monetary policy, investments, economic growth, employment, exports, current accounts deficits, budget surpluses. All of these are impressive, and I believe that the Egyptian government doesn't get enough credit for these very difficult steps that it is taking to improve its economy. That's a legitimate thing that the government of President Sisi should be praised for and should be congratulated for. And the government, in addition to its macroeconomic efforts, is trying to, you know, soften the blow for the poor in general in Egypt. And that's a good thing. But there's a lot to do and a lot that is wrong. Pew Research, which, as many of you know, is one of the most important research organizations in the world, especially in the United States, has done through the years something which they call a measurement of social hostility, what's called the Social Hostilities Index, SHI, which is defined as a measure of concrete hostile actions that effectively hinder the religious activities of the targeted group or individual. This is hostile action as defined by Pew, not necessarily by the state or by the government, but by private individuals, by organizations, or by social groups. It's social hostility. It's in the society. In a way, this is much worse than a hostile government, than a brutal government or a bad government. It's much, much worse because governments come and go, rulers come and go. But if something is deeply embedded in the society, it's in a sense much more significant and much more dangerous. According to this Pew Research on the Social Hostilities Index, Egypt ranks in the highest category for Social Hostilities Index. The Middle East, by the way, is the worst category of any region in the world for Social Hostilities Index. So Egypt is in the same category as India, Russia, Israel, Palestinian territories, Iraq, Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. So tolerance, lack of compassion, and respect for the others is a problem. But is it an economic problem, or can it be an economic problem? I believe that it is. Hatred and bigotry, the type that we see against Coptic Christians in Egypt, are factors that contribute to inefficiency, to lack of economic growth in one way or another. They are factors that will help in developing a more productive economy, in providing more economic opportunity across the board for Egypt. Why is that? Because social harmony, social peace is a good in and of itself and has an economic benefit. It is hard to imagine sustained economic growth in societies racked by violence and hatred. In addition to that, the kind of poisonous eruption of violence that we see, say, for example, in Said in Upper Egypt, something which looks like a pogrom that you might see in Tsarist Russia or in the American South of the 19th century, has a cost in the world of economics, in the world of investments. I worked as a chief of mission in Africa in two places that had a very bad reputation, in Sudan and Equatorial Guinea. They were both countries that were rich in natural resources, unlike Egypt. But there were places where companies, where multinationals, where big investors refused to participate. They walked away from riches because of the reputational cost to companies, to Western companies working in those situations. Yes, you can always get the Chinese, you can always get the Turks, you can always get the Malaysians. There are always bottom feeders that are willing to go and work in terrible places, no matter what kind of country it is. It doesn't matter to them. If they can make a little money, they'll go. But if you're talking about top shelf companies, multinational companies and investors that want to succeed and want to look good, sooner or later, there's going to be a cost to hatred. There's going to be a cost to bigotry, and that's going to be an economic cost. I would say that the kind of pervasive hatred, the kind of pervasive bigotry and discrimination that you see in Egypt, not so much by the state, but by society, can be more damaging in a way than something like an ISIS attack. The ISIS attack, it's very easy to blame Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, somebody far away. It's very easy to blame a kind of globalized jihadism for an attack on a church or something like that that we've seen in Egypt. But something which is localized, something which is natural, something which is endemic, in a way is much more damaging to the good name of a state, to the good name of a country. In the end, I believe that beyond the economic, the radicalization of society and the marginalization of minorities, as we have with Coptic Christians in Egypt, institutionalizes revolution. It institutionalizes the possibility, if not the probability, of violent rebellion, not against minorities, not only against minorities, but against the state itself. I think that often this kind of hatred, this kind of bigotry becomes, as I said, institutionalized and is like a bacillus, a dangerous toxin, a dangerous disease preserved in a laboratory and dependent on being preserved by the electricity being on all the time. And as we know in the Middle East and including in Egypt, the electricity is not on all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sarah Yerkes. She is a fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where her research focuses on Tunisia's political, economic, and security development, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East and North Africa. She is also an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University and has taught at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Dr. Yerkes received her doctorate in government from Georgetown University in 2012, and we're very pleased and looking forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I think this is also my third or fourth time at the conference, and I'm very happy to be here to address all of you. So I think it is interesting that this topic has a sort of broad topic, and that you sort of focus more on the economic cost. My remarks will be a little bit different, which I think is a good thing, that we can all speak about something different. But mostly, I think we hear a lot about violence, about some of the horrible acts that are happening, attacks on Copts. I'm not going to talk so much about that. I'm saying this up front to recognize this is happening, this is occurring, but I want to focus a little bit more on the societal level, on looking at what is the discrimination, the societal challenges that are facing Copts, and what can be done to counter them. So the main theme of what I'm going to talk about today is the disconnect between rhetoric and reality. And what I mean by that is that while on paper there is religious equality in Egypt, in practice there's significant discrimination and marginalization that exists. For example, the Constitution states that Muslims and Christians are equal, but it also makes Islam the state religion, relegating Christians and other non-Muslims to secondary status. The official message of both the church and the Sisi regime is that the relationship between Copts and the state is the best that it has ever been, but we continue to see persistent discrimination. Under the Sisi regime, we've also seen high levels of religiously motivated violence and terrorism, including regular violent attacks by Muslim Egyptians, as well as Egyptian security forces on Christians in Egypt. This lower level of violence usually comes about as a result over disagreements over interfaith relationships, church construction, and property disputes. We've also seen a rise in terrorism targeting Christians. The Islamic State's Sinai province has killed 103 Copts in Egypt to date. And this results in complaints that the state has not done enough to protect Christians from the terror attacks that are targeting them. So returning to this divide between rhetoric and reality, while we've seen some positive gestures of the state, these are mostly symbolic. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples here. One is the opening of the Church of the Nativity in the new administrative capital, the largest cathedral in the Middle East, which is a very good thing. We've seen President Sisi support this. We've seen him attending Christmas Eve Mass, and also the announcement in December of a committee to combat sectarian violence and a new church construction law in 2016. But as I'll discuss, these measures fall short. So let me focus in a little more depth on two of them. The first is the Committee to Combat Sectarianism, known officially as the High Committee to Counter Sectarian Violence, which was formed on December 30th of 2018. On its face, this is a great idea, to establish an official body to try to combat what has been a growing trend of sectarian violence in Egypt. The committee is tasked with looking into and dealing with sectarian incidents, as well as to develop a strategy to prevent them from taking place in the future. But the committee looks at sectarianism purely through a terrorism lens. It fails to acknowledge the long-standing discrimination across all levels of society, which often spurs violence. The committee membership makes this very clear. The members are made up of people from the armed forces, military intelligence, general intelligence, and the National Security Agency. The committee is chaired by the President's advisor on security and anti-terrorism affairs, making clear that this is a committee designed to counter terrorism, which has a real cost on the lack of countering discrimination. There are no representatives of the judiciary or the legislature, who could help Egypt develop the legal reforms it needs to stem sectarianism in the first place. There are no experts on human rights or civil rights to help with that really important aspect of sectarianism. There's also criticism that the committee fails to include scholars or intellectuals to help get at the emotional and the cultural underpinnings of sectarianism. And even worse, the committee is missing representatives from minority groups in the marginalized communities themselves, such as the Coptic community, who are the victims of sectarianism. So this is just one example of a top-down approach that the state has taken to get at an issue without listening to the voices of the actual people who are affected by it. Second, the church construction law, which was passed in September 2016. The law was also set out to address a really important problem, which is the numerous issues of church construction and the renovation process, and to provide a more streamlined and fair process to build, renovate, and repair churches. I'll give you one quick statistic. So first of all, there's a lack of data overall regarding these issues, but according to the latest data, which is from 2011, in Egypt, there's one mosque for every 665 Muslims, while there's only one church for every 2,780 Christians. So clearly there's a need to build more churches. And again, on paper, this is a great idea. Address some of the longstanding problems with church construction, put governors in charge of approving permits rather than the president, who had to approve all the permits himself. And it creates a pathway for unlicensed churches to gain state recognition, including allowing unlicensed churches to keep operating while they're undergoing permit review. But it has not had the impact it was supposed to have. According to a report by the Project on Middle East Democracy, as of November 2018, the government had issued only 8 permits for new church construction. The rate of permit approval is actually lower than it was under President Mubarak. Approvals for church renovation and repairs have been similarly slow under the law. And of the nearly 3,800 unlicensed churches waiting to be legalized, the authorities have recognized only 508 of them to date. Furthermore, state institutions have forced 22 churches to close since the law came into force. While 8 have been approved, 22 have closed, meaning there's actually a net loss in the number of churches under this new law. And the law also has another harmful effect, another harmful cost, which is that part of the point of this law is to speed up the repair and the recovery of churches. Again, that's a great idea on paper. But by actually quickly going in and trying to repair churches, you're losing a lot of really valuable forensic evidence that's necessary to try to actually bring justice and find the perpetrators of these attacks on churches. But in both cases of these laws, neither of them addresses the issue of persistent discrimination. As you all probably know, religious minorities face discrimination in every sector of society. They're underrepresented in important fields, including the judiciary, local and national government, high-ranking military positions, police and law enforcement, and diplomatic positions. Copts are rarely appointed as mayors, even in villages where Christians make up the majority of the population. There's discrimination in universities and in the education curriculum. And although quotas were put in place in the last parliamentary election, only 6% of the legislature is Christian today. So what are the results of some of this marginalization? First of all, there's the clear failure to make progress on church construction, which leaves Copts without a legal place to worship. And as I mentioned at the beginning, much of the violence that occurs is based on this idea, either on disputes over building churches or just on the idea of churches themselves in illegal places of worship. This also leads to continued violence against Copts. Because Sisi has this claim that he's actually protecting Copts, the violence is allowed to continue. There's a real culture of impunity that's been created because there is a top-down legal framework to address some of these issues. And paradoxically, because President Sisi has this rhetoric of cozying up to the Copts, it's actually harmed them. It's made Copts a bigger target for the Islamic State and other terror groups who want to attack them. And the continued discrimination and marginalization also breeds frustration and discontent. There's little recourse for victims of sectarian violence and their families. Much of them have to go through reconciliation sessions that are extra legal, that don't allow people who are victims of violence and victims of discrimination to actually go through the court system. And finally, there's an impact on foreign policy. Because of the ill treatment of Copts is downplayed by the church and the state, it makes it very difficult for Copts to request asylum when they try to move outside of Egypt. These cases are not well documented, and therefore it's harder for them to actually make their case. So what can be done? Just a very few quick points. One is that the Egyptian government needs to enforce all of the provisions of church construction, including allowing for the speedy review of permits. Second, it needs to root out the culture of discrimination through education, starting at the lowest levels, to focus on multiculturalism and to teach about all religions. They also need to do away with the reconciliation sessions and prosecute all cases of religious violence through the regular court system. But to do all of this requires a census that's fair and accurate to determine the actual population of Copts in Egypt, that you can figure out what the population is and how to actually give the correct resources, something that's not likely to happen anytime soon.
Thank you. Finally, we have Mr. Bahey Eldin Hassan. He is the founding director of Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. He is an author and human rights defender and was one of the founders of the human rights movement in Egypt in the 1980s. In 1987, he received the Egyptian Press Syndicate Annual Award. In 1993, he received the Human Rights Defender Award by the Human Rights Watch. One of the most prominent Egyptian activists. Thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you very much for Coptic Solidarity for honoring me and inviting me to its annual conference. And thank you again for having the opportunity. It doesn't accept to speak after Ambassador Fernandez and Dr. Sarah. In fact, they have helped me to make my my mission more easier. Dr. Sarah highlighted many important features of the suffering of Copts in Egypt. Of course, I am not summarizing, but this is my take in relation to what I am going to address. Ambassador Fernandez addressed the question of radicalization, and he focused on what he called social hospitality, and he said that this is maybe more dangerous and more hard or difficult job to tackle if it is not the state. The title of the session, it is about radicalization, the process of radicalization. And in this regard, there is a question maybe we would have to answer. Such radicalization, from where it has been developed?
Nigeria operates using movements or associations who advocate.
Or is it a historical development? All the Egyptians were very religious. Also under Christianity, it was the same, of course, after Islam. So, is it something, sorry to say, God-made or handmade or human handmade? And if we would say that it is human handmade, so why? This is ordinary Muslims. They decided to go to this direction, and when this happened, when Islam came to Egypt, or after the French invasion or the British invasion, or after July 52 first military coup in Egypt. This is what I would try to address, and also may I would have, I'm not sure, different interpretation of what Ambassador Fernandez named as social physicality. Yes, there are social physicalities, long-standing and consistent, but from where? This would be helpful to develop a plan of action or strategy to address the radicalization and such social disadvantages. So, but I would start from the current situation. We have a President Abdel Fattah Sisi, who presented himself as the protector of Copts. In fact, he almost said, or conveying the message, that he is the only thing that stands between Copts and absolute chaos. He considers this status as one of his pillars of legitimacy, not in Egypt, but with the West, and in particular with the United States. And this is why when he comes to the United States, he works hard with team to mobilize not Muslims to rally for him, no, to mobilize Copts to rally for him. And this is, of course, to consolidate more and more his self-image that he is the protector of Copts. But I guess you would agree with me that Sisi has failed to uphold the minimum rights of Copts as Egyptian citizens. In this context, after we heard what we heard from Dr. Sarah, it is hard to understand why such suffering, which Dr. Sarah highlighted, takes place while the protector of Copts enjoys great power when compared to all other Egyptian religions, including Nasser. President Sisi issued unconstitutional law, amended the constitution in an unconstitutional manner. It's very strong, even over the law and over the constitution. And he consolidated his authority over other branches of the government, such as the judiciary, the legislature, to unprecedented levels, even in comparison with Nasser. He imprisoned senior military leaders and the senior military intelligence and the officers, and even military presidential candidates. He is also responsible for the disappearing and the extrajudicial killing of thousands and the execution of over 100. President Sisi also ordered the spending of much needed billions of dollars on mega projects, but with no prospects of return and without even conducting feasibility studies. All those who, as much as voice different opinion, are imprisoned in Egypt. However, when it comes to the rights of the Copts, Sisi has proven to be helpless, very weak. The strong man, the strong president, which we read about in particular in US media and international media, when it comes to Copts, helpless. Progress never exceeds cosmetic and superficial initiatives. As you know, I don't need to give examples. And this is due to the absence of political will. Because, as you see, he is empowered enough to do all what I mentioned and more, and you can recall more than I will mention. It is not question of ability, but it is a question of the lack of political will. In this regard, the rule of law hasn't just collapsed in Egypt, it has become absurd. Anyone could be arrested at any time for any reason. In this dystopia, anyone could be kidnapped by security forces and executed and then again labeled as a terrorist. And this is now in the air by not only by human rights NGOs, but also by, for instance, very alarming and worrying report by Reuters press agency. Anyone could spend any amount of years in prison for absolutely no reason, for being just for being at the wrong time at the wrong place. In such a Kafkaesque context, it is hard to assume Copt would acquire minimum degree of survival. I'm sorry to say that, and I hope that during the rest of the day and tomorrow, some other presentation would help to convince us to the opposite. However, we should not forget that Copts relatively enjoyed their life in different times with the same people, with the same Muslim community, with the same Islam. I'm not saying that it was a heaven. Was the case before the first military coup of 1954. Where Copts and the other minorities, not only Copts, more important, there was the Jews also. There was a large Jewish minority in Egypt. And they, as I guess many of you are aware, many of them were very popular artists, writers, and even in politics. Not only Jews, but also Armenians, Greeks, and the many other different communities that benefited from the openness of that era. Jews and the Copts were widely popular politicians and artists, as I mentioned. I guess the problem started when the question of minority in Egypt has become a national security question. And this is started with 1952. This is something not born just a few years ago, or it was not the case before 1952. In one of his recent speech, I'm talking about Sisi, which effectively, those speech, only address the West, not the Egyptians. Despite that, he said that in Egypt. Sisi implied that Muslims are responsible for extremism. However, this overlooks how and why extremism thrives. The situation in Egypt today is a product of over 65 years of dealing with the minority issue as a national security question, of heavy-handed military and security. In the 50s, Jews and foreign minorities became national security issue, which later expanded to include forms of religious, political, and intellectual plurality. Even within Islam, I mean, even against Muslim Shia, not only against non-Muslims. The neglect of free and critical thinking education, on one hand, which launched or started after 1952, and on the other hand, the expansion of uncritical religious indoctrination as a counterweight to political Islam have created the extremist society, or as Ambassador Fernandez call it, social disability, environment for social disability. I would like, in this context, to move to today and to draw your attention to striking fact. The entity which is responsible for not holding the mobs who attack the Copts and the churches accountable, this entity is the same one that refused to name a school just a few days ago after Abanom, the Coptic soldier who died in Sinai 2 weeks ago. It is the same entity that denied a former president medical treatment in prison with the intention to kill him. It is the same policy, the same mentality. It is the same entity. To conclude, I believe that Coptic rights are attainable within all encompassing answer to Egypt's human rights crisis by working through universal rights-based approach that addresses Copts' rights through defending freedoms of religious belief, expression, and so forth. Thank you very much for your attention.